Welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. We've come to the end of the period of Jewish holidays. I hope everyone had a peaceful and meaningful month of September with the opportunity for family, which is complicated, friends, which is even more complicated, and food, as well as introspection and gratitude. I really hope so, because today we're headed for a part of the world that provides very little in the way of peaceful anything, and that is Lebanon. Our guest, the really outstanding Hussain Abdul-Hussain, will focus largely on a rather bizarre situation brewing over the importation of energy for Lebanon's electrical system, but how Lebanon got into this mess and whether there's any hope for getting out. This will also be on the table. Before we go to Hussain, here is your JPC commercial. The Jewish Policy Center was established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. You can read there our insight articles, our blog in context, and our magazine In Focus Quarterly. The fall issue of In Focus will be out next week. It was supposed to be a series of conversations about the 20 years since 9/11/2001. But clearly we had to recalibrate in light of the, the ignominious departure of the United States from Afghanistan. So I invite you to take a look when it goes up. We are going to look more at the future and less at the past, or begin a subscription for the printed magazine by going to the website. Again, that's jewishpolicycenter.org. JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, we advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, that's a big one right now, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we've been very pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including Russia and China, various aspects of Israeli policy, including the Abraham Accords, but not limited to that, Iran sanctions, what's been going on in Iran, including horrible violations of human rights, which we talked about last week, and the continued Iranian cheating on the Iran nuclear deal. All of these and more are available on our website and on Facebook. As a reminder, as we get started here, you can send your questions during the presentation by using the Q&A function on your screen. Hussain Abdul-Hussain is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He focuses on the Gulf region and Yemen, including Gulf relations with Iran and Gulf peace with Israel. We're not doing those today. Born and raised in Beirut, Baghdad, and Baalbek, three cities that have been the theater for major Middle Eastern events, not pleasant ones. Hussain earned a degree in history and archaeology at the American University of Beirut. He worked as a reporter and later as managing editor at Beirut's The Daily Star. He's reported from war zones on the Lebanese border with Israel and from Iraq. In Washington, Hussain has helped to set up and manage the Arabic satellite network Al-Hura Iraq, after which he headed the Washington bureau of the Kuwaiti daily Al-Ra'i. He's been a visiting fellow at London's Chatham House and published in English in the New York Times and Washington Post, and in Arabic in all kinds of places. He's been quoted by Vox, the Jerusalem Post, and Newsweek. He's appeared on CNN and MSNBC in English, and he's a commentator, he's a contributor on major Arabic satellite networks. Before he went to FTD, Hussain and I met on Twitter, which is a little bit like using a blind dating service. You don't really know who you're talking to. But then I found his writing, and he has an article in the summer issue of In Focus entitled Why There Is No Palestinian State, which I consider must reading. And all of his stuff is great. So from this Twitter relationship, which begins in a shaky way for everybody, he has become a major resource for excellent information on the Middle East, specifically on Lebanon, and then on other things. So Hussain Abdul-Hussain, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shoshana, for the great introduction. Thanks to JPC for inviting me. As you said, today we'll be talking about Lebanon, which is currently in the headlines. I think it's always been in the headlines. I'll try, without taking a deep dive into history, I'll just try to give you a background about the country, mainly about the economy. Lebanon suffered 15 years of civil war that ended in the year 1990 with the end of the Cold War. And by the time the US was trying to construct a new Middle East, and that new Middle East, Lebanon, was handed over to two regional powers at the time that managed it jointly. It was Syria and Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia, what the Saudis had in mind was to make of Lebanon a services economy, a prosperous country with a growing economy. And what Syria and its ally Iran had in mind was to keep Lebanon as a battlefield, sometimes to blackmail Israel, other times to blackmail the United States. So these were the two models, and for some reason, these two models managed to coexist for so many years, at least until 2005, when Hezbollah decided to kill Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, who was the ally of Saudi Arabia. So Hariri did a great job in reconstructing the country after the civil war, but by the time he was killed, the model that he had put in place had not come to its end. The economy was not growing, of course, because Hezbollah had all sorts of wars, whether with Israel or whether in Syria, or whether all the terrorist networks that Hezbollah has around the globe. What happened was that Hariri was killed, but the country kept on borrowing money, and Hariri used to borrow to make the economy grow, but because Hezbollah is fighting all the time, the country was borrowing and the economy was not growing. Over the past few years, I think the Lebanese central bank ran what looked like a Ponzi scheme. They kept on raising interest on foreign currency and using people's deposits just to make the state work and function. The Ponzi scheme came to its end by the summer of 2019, and since then the currency has been in free fall. The economy has been in free fall, and this has put pressure. Of course, people have been taking to the street all the time. People have been opposing the government. People have been opposing the Hezbollah model. People have been demanding that Hezbollah stops the wars and make of Lebanon just a normal country that does not war, and that just makes a country that has its economy growing. But of course, Hezbollah is the most dominant force. No one can make it move or change course on behalf of Iran, of course. And it threatens Israel with war every day. And with every threat, the economy takes a bigger hit because no one would want to invest in a country that can go to war any minute. So the country has been running out of foreign currency. It has spent almost all the foreign currency it has, which means that the country cannot import anything. Most importantly, it can't import basic staple, which is wheat and fuel to keep the lights on, and more important than the lights, to keep hospitals on and to keep medicine working. What happened over a few weeks ago, the American University of Beirut issued a statement saying that they had run out of fuel and that they had at least 100 patients who were going to die in a week if there's no fuel source made available to them. During the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, the American University of Beirut had the US Embassy provided with fuel to keep it going. This time too, the US Embassy tried to come up with a solution. This time, the US Embassy thought that the World Bank can buy gas from Egypt, Egyptian gas, and that this gas can be shipped through a pipeline that exists at least since the year 2010. It can be shipped from Egypt northward to Jordan, and then from there it'll have to cross Syria and go to Lebanon. The idea is that Lebanon has only one plant that produces electricity on gas, and it's a power plant in the north. That power plant would produce 435 megawatts. Lebanon needs 3,100 megawatts. So you can see that the amount to be produced would amount to 12% of what Lebanon needs. But I think everyone is thinking that this electric supply can be used at least for the basic stuff, which is hospitals, medicine storage, the airport, for example, just like the vital, most important sectors. The problem with this is that when the pipelines go through Syria, they'll have to be, the US will have to give waivers against the sanctions that we've imposed on Syria over the past, I think, 2 years now. The Caesar Act, which was approved and with bipartisan consensus in Congress and signed by President Trump, it just cuts the Syrian economy and the Syrian government out of the global economy. For the pipelines to go through Syria, we'll have to issue waivers, or some sort of compromise will have to be invented with the Syrian government. Now, many think that this will be a pretext through which Syria can get millions of dollars from the pipelines, and it can also be a pretext for future schemes when the Syrian will say, okay, we need electricity as well, so you can give us more waivers. So waivers might pile up, and this will really undermine whatever sanction system the US imposes, whether on Iran or Syria or any other country in the world. So as the debate goes on, I think the United States has a moral obligation to help support hospitals like the American University of Beirut, but we also have alternatives. So we do not have to offer waivers to Assad or to any other government that uses chemical weapons on its own people. What we can do is that we can make the World Bank make the money available for oil shipments that go straight to Lebanon to help produce whatever 10% electric supply that we were planning to produce. Other ideas include hiring ships that can generate electricity and just provide Lebanon. And Lebanon used to hire Turkish ships in the past when it used to have money to do this, but now when they ran out of money, the ships just left. So what I'm saying here is that there are many alternatives for us to keep our, to just stand up to our morals and ethics and not let the Lebanese and the Lebanese hospitals shut down. But at the same time, there's no reason why we should give the Assad regime a pretext to skirt a few sanctions to get a few $1 million that we know, of course, the Assad regime will use to buy more arms and to kill more Syrians. So that's in a nutshell what's going on in Lebanon. Just a few points to keep in mind. There are no US sanctions whatsoever on Lebanon or the state of Lebanon. Whatever you see that's going on in Lebanon, the economic collapse and free fall, is because of the model that I told you about that's not working. For the Lebanese model to work, Hezbollah has to be disarmed and the country has to become a normal country with a sovereign state. And that will give confidence to foreign investors to come to Lebanon, and with foreign investors will come foreign currency. And that's how the solution for Lebanon works. Now, unfortunately, the way the world, and especially the US and Europe, are thinking of solutions for Lebanon, I think they have just temp solutions, and these include producing some electricity, bankrolling the army. So far, the United States has offered Lebanon $372 million so far this year, and this money goes to feeding hungry people. It goes to bankrolling the troops of the Lebanese army. So we are basically trying to keep a totally dead state. We're trying to keep it somehow alive, or at least partially alive. I think this is this kind of a patch-up solution is somehow okay, but on the long term, even on the medium term, I don't think this is good, neither for the Lebanese nor for everybody else in the region who's suffering because of Assad or because of Hezbollah. Of course, as I speak today, we learned that Jordan is normalizing relations with Israel for reasons we're still not sure of. Jordan is resuming normal relations. The Royal Jordanian aircraft will be flying regular flights between Damascus and Amman. Now, mind you, Royal Jordanian has 2 direct flights from Amman to Chicago and to New York. So maybe we should tell them you have to choose between Damascus and New York. It's up to the Jordanians, of course, and it's up to our legislators and our administration to handle this situation. But for reasons that are not clear to many of us, Jordan is normalizing. This might start a process of normalization with Assad, which is not good for anyone who's trying to stop the many wars that are going on in the region. One good point, we have to give credit where credit is due. Yesterday, the State Department issued a statement saying that the United States is not going to normalize, upgrade, or talk to Assad, which is a great position. The State Department also said that it encourages friends not to normalize with Assad, which is good, but which is not enough. We can do more than encourage allies and friends not to talk to Assad. We can convince them. At times, we can use probably a bit more pressure to make them not to talk to Assad. There's a US sanctions regime placed on Assad, and it might hit friends and allies if they try to pass it. With that, I think I'll just open the floor to questions.
We have questions. So the first question, people are writing in even as we're speaking. So let's just go with what we got. In order for this gas shipment to get to Lebanon, it has to go through Syria. That requires a waiver of sanctions. What if you heard about the likelihood that we would do that? Is there any sense in the Congress that it would be a good idea to waive sanctions on Syria, at least temporarily?
Well, first of all, the problem is that the idea came from our ambassador in Lebanon. So it's not something that was thrown onto us. It was something that we invented. And the idea was that the World Bank was planning to help Lebanon in some aspects, including paying for this kind of electricity. So we thought we give the World Bank money to Egypt and pump gas northward. I don't see a reason why we should do that through the pipelines in Egypt. I just think we can use the money to pay shipments of oil that go to straight to the Lebanese power plants, like the Lebanese used to do when they used to have money. So this is one thing. The other thing is that what we've heard from the Hill is that senators and members of Congress, most of whom oppose skirting any Caesar sanctions, because as you know, this won bipartisan support in Congress. These members of Congress are also thinking of the human side. They're thinking there's no way we will say okay to shutting down hospitals in Lebanon. So I think if we offer members of Congress an alternative to the plan that we don't think is the best plan on the table, if we offer them alternatives to keep hospitals going while at the same time not pumping gas through the Jordanian is fine, but not pumping gas through any Syrian networks, whether pipelines or whether shipping electricity through the Syrian grid, which was another suggestion that Jordan, we buy electricity from Jordan and it goes through the grid all the way to Lebanon. So short of doing any of these two things that will force us to talk to Assad and issue some waivers to some sanctions of Assad, we can certainly offer the members of Congress alternatives, which we hope they will accept and support instead of the previous scheme that we have on the table now.
So you mentioned oil ships, which is the way a lot of countries deal with this. There was a story about an Iranian oil tanker headed for Lebanon, and then it seems to have disappeared. Did it disappear? Did it dock? What happened to the Iranian oil ship? Because that would be a violation by Lebanon, wouldn't it? Taking Iranian oil would be a violation of the sanctions on Iran. So that makes Lebanon a violator. What happened to the ship?
Well, that's a great question. First, let me note that Lebanon has at least a dozen power plants for producing electricity. Only the smallest one of them produces electricity using gas. All the others use oil, which makes sense if we send oil instead of the gas. The Iranian ship that sailed all the way from Iran through the Mediterranean, it docked in Tartus in Syria to the north of Lebanon. And from there, I think they just carried shipments of diesel fuel to Lebanon. Well, that way, because Syria is sanctioned anyway, so there were no repercussions on Syria. And that way, Hezbollah just got it, they shipped some fuel to Lebanon. Well, one thing about that ship, which Hezbollah, of course, tried to hype as being the savior of the Lebanese, all the oil that it got from Iran could technically last Lebanon for 3 days. So the amount of fuel oil that was shipped to Syria was not really something to help Lebanon. Now, mind you also that in Iran, they have shortage of gas for cars because gas for cars needs more refining than the fuel that they use for producing electricity. So Iran itself is facing shortages, the same shortages that Lebanon is facing. And I don't think that a country that's facing shortages can help another country, even if Iran, we all know that Iran has a huge reserve of oil.
So now we have several questions focusing on the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's not really Lebanese. It's not really part of Lebanon. It is funded by Iran. How did Hezbollah get to be what it is in Lebanon? I mean, it's clearly controlling things. How did it get there?
Well, it's one thing about Hezbollah is that it's so many things to so many people. So and Hezbollah is clearly, it has too many layers. The main core of Hezbollah is exactly what you said. It's a Lebanese mercenary group that takes its orders from Iran. And with orders, it also takes funding, of course, to build whatever organization that it has going. Now, one thing about Hezbollah is that this would not have been, this scenario is not good enough for the Lebanese because the Shia, which is the main constituent sect or group that hosts Hezbollah, because as you might know, Iran is majority Shia, so Iran tries to connect with other Shia in the Middle East. The Shia of Lebanon are 1/3 of the population. So even if you pay all the Shia, you will still have 2/3 of the population that will go against you. And I'd say that Hezbollah skillfully played the Lebanese system to control it. And of course, this is a known tactic when you divide and conquer. So they used the old game that the oligarchs have been using for the past centuries, I guess. And what they do is that they promise one faction that, okay, we will support your bid to presidency if you take our side. And then they gang up with the Christians, with the Maronite Christians against the Sunnis, who are mostly supportive of Saudi Arabia and the anti-Iranian alliance in the region. So they single out the Sunnis, and then the Sunnis will be the 1/3, and you have 2/3 going with Hezbollah in Iran. So Hezbollah uses the game to its advantage inside of Lebanon. Now, of course, with money decreasing from Iran, Hezbollah had to come up with innovative ideas. And of course, here comes the drug trade, illicit traffic, all kinds of trade, diamond trade, you name it, Africa, South America. Hezbollah has networks around the world, and now they use these networks to fund their organization, of course, with money from Iran decreasing. And what we know for a fact is that Hezbollah has been using Iraq heavily because of the Iranian axis. The Iranian axis has Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The only country of in this axis that has American support and that wins American favoritism is Iraq. Even though we try to monitor the Iraqi banking system closely, Hezbollah can still use it. And most of the money that they're getting, that they're laundering, most of the time, they're doing it through Iraq. Of course, they are also trying to do it through Gulf countries, Kuwait and Qatar. Last week, Department of Treasury imposed sanctions on 2 Kuwaitis for laundering money on behalf of Hezbollah. Yesterday, they imposed sanctions on 4 or 5 Qataris for doing the same through Qatar. So they're doing this all over the place, and it's part of the global war of terrorism, or the global war on or against financing terrorism that the Treasury Department is thankfully still waging against these groups and this kind of funding inside of Lebanon and all the countries of the region.
So in effect, Hezbollah is separate from a lot of the rest of Lebanon because the other groups in Lebanon don't have access to private money. So they can play the game of bringing in the Druze on this issue and the Christians on that issue and playing the teams off against each other. But is Hezbollah the only one that actually has its own income source and foreign patronage?
Well, I wouldn't say it has always been the only one. What Hezbollah has had, and it's been the only one that's have had this, is military power. So after 1990, with the end of the civil war, Lebanon had more than a dozen armed factions, and the Taif agreement, which ended the civil war, stipulated that all militias disband, give up their arms, disband, and join the security forces. And all militias did abide by that stipulation, except for Hezbollah, and that happened with the sponsorship of the Assad regime at the time, which was dominating Lebanon, and of course with a nudge from Iran. So even if you have politicians who can outsmart Hezbollah, and this happened several times, Hariri was one of the politicians who outsmarted Hezbollah in 2005, they killed him, and they killed him. I'm not accusing them, that's what the UN said. That's what a tribunal by the UN accused Hezbollah of doing. And after Hariri, many other politicians outsmarted Hezbollah in the political game, and they were either killed or at times Hezbollah invaded the Druze region. The southern part of Mount Lebanon was invaded with Hezbollah when the Druze chief Jumblat just outsmarted Hezbollah. So they have two things. They're playing the game, but if they lose, they kill and they beat you. And if you try to campaign against them, say in election, so they have elections coming up in Lebanon next year. If anyone tries to campaign on anything that's not to Hezbollah's liking, anyone will be killed, harassed, sent into exile. So the arms thing really plays a huge part domestically, even though Hezbollah tries to say all the time that the arms that it has, it only uses against Israel, which it does from time to time, but it also uses the same formidable militia that it has against rivals in Lebanon. The last of which was the killing of our dear friend Luqman Slim in February. He was just assassinated in Lebanon. And it was unfortunate at the time that the State Department just issued a statement saying, we call on the Lebanese judiciary to bring the perpetrators to justice, which is really, we know that the Lebanese judiciary, if everyone is scared of Hezbollah's arms, the judges will also be scared of Hezbollah's arms.
So you mentioned at one point, excuse me, that there were demonstrations against the government. In 2019, there were a lot of demonstrations actually, and many of them were specifically against Hezbollah, and they were accompanied by demonstrations in Iraq against the Iraqi government and demonstrations in Iran against the Iranian government. So first of all, I know COVID had a lot to do with ending some of those demonstrations because people had to go home and they had to stay home. But first of all, were those uprisings of regular Lebanese citizens or Iraqi citizens or Iranian citizens? Is it possible to resurrect those? And is it possible, these are all questions that come together. Is it possible to get rid of Hezbollah, or do you actually have to get rid of Iran to make the rest of the stuff work?
Well, first, if these protesters will come back to the street, there are two factors. One, most of the time, these people take to the streets spontaneously. So we can't really tell when they decide to say enough is enough. Another factor is that when these people go to the street, more often than not, they have their eye on Western reaction, and they try to gauge our reaction and see what we will do. And I think they've learned in Lebanon and Iraq and even in Iran, they've learned that if they go to the street, they will be killed. No one will come to their rescue. And this has been a recurrent theme. And I think at this point, these same activists that you saw that took the street on October 17, 2019, that's the day that the Lebanese used to call it the revolution. Most of these activists have now left the country. You wanted to say something?
No, I was just surprised. I didn't know that they'd left the country, but it makes sense that they would. Yeah.
So that's when on demonstrations. The second point about what will it take to disband Hezbollah, I would say it's definitely the Iranian regime. I mean, at the end of the day, Hezbollah it proclaims itself to be loyal to the Iranian regime. I mean, it's not us who are accusing Hezbollah of being a mercenary fighting group. That's how they describe themselves. So if the Iranian regime ever collapses or rolls back or sits back or just let everyone do their thing, I think Hezbollah will just sink away. It'll just fade away. But this is not happening so far. I'd say there are other ways of just tilting the status quo inside the country to make other people as strong as Hezbollah, not necessarily support everyone to engage in civil war, but just to draw some red lines to tell Hezbollah that, well, if accidents befall your opponents, accidents might also befall you. So if there's some sort of deterrence inside of Lebanon, I think that would help convince Hezbollah to change course. But at this point, I think Hezbollah is the most formidable force in the country, so no one will ever dare challenge it. And it'll remain so as long as it's getting patronage, money, funding, sponsorship, you name it, from Iran. So as long as the situation is like this, I don't think any Lebanese have a chance of standing up to it, or I don't think any Lebanese will have more ambition because many tried in the past and they lost. So I think at this point everyone is waiting to see what comes next.
There is one other armed group in Lebanon, and it's the one that Americans, if they pay attention to Lebanon, it's the one the Americans care about because we fund it in part, and that is the Lebanese Armed Forces. The US government says that it gives money to the Lebanese Armed Forces, not just money, but training and equipment and money to the LAF, because we believe, our government believes, that this is the protector of the people. I don't see them protecting the people so well. Number one, if you have Hezbollah who's controlling whether demonstrators get shot at or need to leave the country. And number two, the question arises, is the LAF, I don't want to say a part of Hezbollah. It's not a part of Hezbollah. It's the army of the Lebanese state. But the government is controlled by Hezbollah. So how much freedom does the Lebanese armed force have to do something, say protect demonstrators in the street or oust Hezbollah, for example? Because they still work for them. What's the role of the LAF? And should we be funding it? This is a question that has come up. I've got 7 or 8 questions in my little box here about, should the United States continue to give the Lebanese armed forces money under the circumstances?
Uh, in my opinion, the short answer to whether we should keep on funding the Lebanese army, the short answer is no. Now, to explain how I came to this no is that you have to keep in mind that there are a third military force in Lebanon, and that's the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, which was created in 1978, interim, and still here 43 years after it was created. This force was expanded in 2006 from 2,000, who were mainly observers, to 10,000, which became a military force. It cost the UN $500 million a year. The United States pays 150 million roughly of the total. According to UN Security Council Resolution 1701, this UN force is tasked with making sure that Hezbollah does not store any weapons south of the Litani River in southern Lebanon. This was in the aftermath of the 2006 war with Israel. Since 2006, whenever the UN convoys tried to bust any Hezbollah caches, they were intercepted by a group that the Lebanese media call the locals. These locals are, we know that these are just Hezbollah operatives. They burn tires to cut streets, and they hurled rocks on the UN force. And this is how Hezbollah established which streets the UN force can go on and which streets it can't. So at this point, or after all these years, the only thing that UNIFIL is doing is that this money is helping the Hezbollah economy grow without actually doing any of the functions that it was tasked with doing from the UN Security Council. So this is the third force that's the third military force that's in Lebanon. The reason I bring up the story of the UN force is because when the Lebanese looked at this UN force and they said, look, the international community came with its arms and money and tried to control Hezbollah, and they couldn't. So you expect our weak Lebanese army to do the job? So this has become the excuse for the Lebanese of thinking that Hezbollah is a global issue and it's not up to the weak Lebanese state and the even weaker Lebanese army to take care of this issue, which makes the Lebanese army just an army for show. So all the money that they get, I have no idea what they do with, because it's not only that they can't control, disarm, or police Hezbollah, they don't even police the basic facilities, the border crossings, the port, the airport. All of these Lebanese, they should be sovereign facilities. All of these facilities are controlled by Hezbollah, which skirts all kinds of supervision or inspection or monitoring. And at times, we know that the army has been in cahoots with Hezbollah. It has either helped the party, or maybe senior officers get paid by operatives from Hezbollah. One last thing to put things in perspective, think that every officer in the Lebanese army until now gets 20, they call them tanks, which is 20 liters. So every officer gets 400 liters of free gas for the cars a month. And at the time when nobody else can find any gas. So the army is really living a life that's more luxurious than the average Lebanese. And our money is helping to keep this going. And there's really nothing coming out of this army at this point. One last point about the army. The politics of the army has been traditionally and until now been made in such a way to position the commander of the army to become president. So think that the last three presidents of Lebanon, Emil Lahoud, Michel Suleiman, and the incumbent Michel Aoun, all three of them were once the commander of the army. So this is what the army is good for. It's just, making presidents in the waiting. Otherwise, I really don't see any use. And hence my answer. The money we pay to the Lebanese army, should we keep on paying it? I'd say no.
I would agree. Okay, you mentioned that the plan for this energy to go to Lebanon through Syria is an American plan. It was started by the American ambassador in Lebanon, who I think was probably trying to do a good thing for certain people inside of Lebanon. Race is another question, though. Historically and traditionally, France has major interests in Lebanon. It was a protectorate of France. It was France who drew the boundaries. I must say the Syrians never liked the boundary that the French drew. What are the French doing these days? Are they helpful? Are they involved? If people in Lebanon feel that the world needs to deal with this problem, I would think that from an American point of view, it's not historically our space, it's French space. The French should be heavily involved, are they?
Well, first, to understand how France is behaving in Lebanon, we have to understand how France is behaving on Iran. And we know that after the nuclear deal with Iran, what happened was that the French and the German, of course, Airbus, which is French-German, signed a contract with Iran for $25 billion. Another contract went to Total, the French energy company, to develop the Pars oil fields in the south. So these $30 billion have kept the French trying to support or revive JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, ever since President Trump pulled out of it. So this is the defining policy of France in the region. They're trying to entertain the Iranians to keep the contracts in case sanctions are ever removed, the sanctions on Iran. So the way the French behave in Lebanon is that they try to entertain Iran by entertaining Hezbollah to make sure that the Iranians still like the French. Now, to add to this, the French think that there are a few industries in Lebanon that can also generate funds for them. And these industries are mainly the electricity, the state electricity, Électricité du Liban, EDL, which is really corrupt. The French think that if this gets reformed and privatized, a French company can take over and can generate profit out of it. Another thing that the French have their eye on is the Port of Beirut, which, as you might know, just took a hit after the August 4 blast of last year. So the French think that the port can also generate money for them. So along these lines, this is how the French think. They're going after the Airbus, the Total, the electricity, and the port contracts in Iran and in Lebanon. And they look, and then they see the Iran regime dominating in Iran and Lebanon, and then they see that Hezbollah is dominating in Lebanon. So what they do is that they try to make nice with the Iran regime and Hezbollah all the time. And that's, of course, hopeful that this will generate revenue to French companies. This is French foreign policy, and it has nothing to do with any geostrategic consideration, with any humanitarian issues, wars, peace, anything else. And at first, the Lebanese were impressed when the French president Macron showed up in Lebanon after the blast and then another visit, and they thought, finally, someone from a big power is interested in us. But I think at this point, if you read the Lebanese media, they're all saying what I'm saying. They came to the conclusion that the French are doing what's in their interest, and what's in their interest is not necessarily in our interest.
That sounds like the French in many, many cases. I shouldn't say that, but it does. Okay, so it sounds to me like Lebanon has been abandoned in many ways by people who could and should be willing to help what used to be a prosperous, reasonably democratic, reasonably free and open country, and now it's a wreck, and now it's basically not a functional state. Now, after the port explosion in Beirut last year, and again, as Lebanon was collapsing a couple of months ago, the state of Israel made offers for emergency assistance after the port explosion, for medical assistance in Lebanon, bring people to Israel, whatever. And again, a couple of months ago. And of course, they get turned down because the Hezbollah government is unlikely to turn to Israel for help. Now, people who listen to this webinar know that I tried to end on an optimistic note, and we're coming to our last question here. So think about this in the optimistic sense, Hussain. Do you think it's possible that the Lebanese people will finally have enough of what's happened to them and be willing to demand that their government look to Israel as a source of at least emergency assistance, If not, future progress. Any hope for Israel and Lebanon and the Lebanese people?
Well, I mean, history tells us that when the Lebanese are ever left to their ways, they end up being friends with Israel, and they try to strike peace, like in May 17, 1982, when they officially, 1983, I'm sorry, when they officially signed a peace document that was later shredded by Assad. But the Lebanese are aware that their economy, which was the GDP was 15 billion at its peak. Now I think it's only 5 billion. They're aware that any economy that's 5 billion sitting next to an economy that's 400 billion, it's totally in your interest to open up to the bigger economy, which is Israel. And the Lebanese are smart. They have world exposure, and they know this, except that they can't say it, or if they say it, they risk their lives. So if Hezbollah's influence, if Iranian influence in Lebanon ever goes down, I think the Lebanese eventually will go to peace with Israel. But at this point, I don't see Lebanese even saying it. They don't even dare say the word peace because, of course, that's understandable. It's a risk to their lives.
Well, that's not exactly an optimistic entry, but I think it's realistic that the real problem here is not the Lebanese people, and it's not the state of Lebanon. It is that Lebanon doesn't have a lot of free choices. Lebanon's choices are determined by other people, and those other people don't like the United States. They don't like Israel. They are Iranian choices. So that's
Absolutely.
a sort of depressing note. However, I feel like we have learned a lot. And next time Lebanon appears in the newspapers, Hussain, I think we'll know a lot more, and we'll be able to put it into a context that Americans can understand better. And that is a positive note. So on behalf of the Jewish Policy Center and our listeners and the people who will come and look at this online, jewishpolicycenter.org, I want to thank you for a really, really important program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.